Hi, welcome to After Academy Tech Learning. In this video, we are going to discuss closure in JavaScript. Closure is one of the most important but also confusing topic for someone who has started with JavaScript programming. But it is also one of the topic that has been literally asked in almost all programming interviews involving a role in JavaScript. If you are new here, do subscribe to our channel and hit the bell button so that you will get latest videos delivered first to you. So let's begin.
You just can't see it now because you haven't had any closure.
No! Closure! That's what it is! That's what I need! God, you're brilliant! Why didn't I think of that? How do I get that? I am over you. And that, my friend, is what they call closure.
So we just saw that how Rachel was able to get closure from the Ross. Now let's describe the situation in our JavaScript code to understand that how the closure works here. So first let's create a function and call it relationship with Ross. And here we are going to pass a parameter called person. And also when Ross gets into relationship with that person, let's create a variable inside it and call it relationship status and set the value to true. And when the relationship starts, let's print on our console. And here what I'm going to do, I'm going to use string template to give a message. And here I'm going to print the person's name and write is in relationship with Ross. And here also I'm going to print the value of the relationship. Okay, so I'll print the relationship status. Okay, now let's run this, but before that we need to call this function for the code to run. So let's see what happens. So person is undefined, we need to get Rachel first in relationship with the Ross. So Rachel is in relationship with Ross. Now the problem, as you can see in the video, was that Rachel went to have a date, but she was still in a relationship, perceived relationship what she had. So now Rachel wants a closure. So basically she wants to change the relationship status. But how can we achieve that? How can we help Rachel in this case? So what we can do, let's do this. Let's create a function, okay? And let's see what happens. And here we will understand what closure is in JavaScript. So let's return a function, okay? And this function, what it will do, it will change the relationship status, and also let's pass a status from outside so that we can change it, the value we want. And it will change the relationship status to that new status. And also let's again print this on screen. So now when Rachel gets into the relationship with Ross, it gets a function returned. Let's call it status or relationship, let's call it. Now Rachel wants to end the relationship, so we can call relationship and set the status to false. Let's run and see what happens. So now Rachel started a relationship with Ross, and here you can see that now she has terminated the relationship. So the clip is now summarized into our program. So now interesting thing to understand here is that this function, you can see this function relationship with Ross, it has got one property, and this property is set to true and it returns a function. So now if you see this function, that when we call this function after calling relationship with Ross, this function has access to relationship status. So even if the function which is enclosing this function is terminated or returned, this function can still hold on the values of this function that has called it. So this is really not very intuitive. If someone is coming from other programming language like Java or C++, they know that if a function returns, all the variables stored in that function is also removed from the memory. But this function is still able to call this function even the function has returned. So this is what JavaScript means by closure. Okay. So closure can be understood by understanding the scope. So let's understand the scope and then we will come back to this code. Now let's try to understand scope. First, let's get this code away. So scope in terms of understanding the closure will come into picture when we have functions having one function contain other functions. Okay, when one function create inner functions, then the closure come into picture. So in this case, the scope can have 3 levels. Okay, so it will have global scope, then outer function scope and inner function scope. Okay, so what do I mean by this? Let's understand with an example. Let's create one variable where call it a global and give a value after academy. Now let's create a function and call it my function. And here what we're going to do, we're going to log this global. Okay, we are going to access this global variable from inside the function and log it. Okay. So here what we are going to do, let's write inside my function and here concat the value of the global. Okay, simple. Now also do this outside so that we can know that this variable can be accessed in the global scope also, but just change the value to outside. And we need to call this function so that it is called. Now let's run this code and see what happens. So first you can see that the inside of the function can refer the global scope variable, and from the global scope obviously you can access the global scope. Okay, this is fine. Now let's create a variable inside my function and call it my variable and set this value to my function or my variable. And let's log this now. And also let's try to log from outside. And let's run this program. So we have got inside my function printed, then inside my function my variable printed, outside global is printed, but this is not printed. So let's see the error log. So you can see that my variable reference is not defined. So global scope cannot access anything inside this my function. Okay, so outer scope, that global cannot access anything of inside the outer function, and similarly you will see that higher scope level cannot access something which is inside it. Okay, but inner one can access the things of the outer one. Okay, so let's now create another function, call it inner. And here what we are going to do is access global and my variable. Okay, so let's do this. This is inner, inside inner function, and global similarly my variable, and we need to call inner. And let's run this program. So this is error. Let's, for time being, let's see now. So here you can see that the program ran out fine, and inside my function you can see you have got this print, and here also in the inner function has access to global, inside inner has access to global, and inner also has access to the outer function variable. Okay, so inner function has access to global and the outer variable, but global does not have access to my function. Similarly, my function will not have anything which is defined in inner. So this is scope. Understanding closure is actually understanding scopes. So in JavaScript, whenever a function is created, for example, here my function is created, and this then goes on to define a function, that is create an inner function, then the inner function will have access to everything that is outside this, outside the inner function within the my function, and obviously the global one. So this portion is called the closure for the inner function, or the lexical environment. Basically these are fancy words. This means that inner function has access to anything which is defined outside of that function which created it. Okay, simple. So what it means is that whenever we define a function inside another function, the inner function creates a closure, and in that closure it can access anything of it parent or parent's parent variables. So even if the function of the parent execution is complete, the inner function can still hold the reference to the variables defined in the parent through closure. Now let's see a very interesting question that generally comes in interviews for understanding closure. So let's remove this. So here we have a for loop. We define a variable I starting with 0, and it will be less than 3, and then I plus plus. Now here we're going to write set timeout, and here we're going to pass a function, and this function will be logging on the console, and it will log the value of I, and we're going to call this timer at one after the other. Okay, so if you see the code block, many times we tend to think that the output will be that for the first loop I is 0, it will log 0, then it becomes 1, it will log 1, and then 2. So we expect the output to be this. But let's run and see what's the actual output. So look, we have 3, 3, 3. So output is not what we expected. So what went wrong here? So if you will see that we have used var here. The var attached the scope of I to the outside of this block. So I lies now outside of this block. So each function when it execute refers the same I, which is now scoped outside. When this function is called 3 times, so it happens within milliseconds. Then after 1 second, the first function is called. The value of I now refers to the final value of the variable, which is 3. So that's why all the 3 calls will refer to the same I which has now become 3. So we have the output as 3. So we may be asked in the interview to solve this problem, that print the correct output. How can we do that? Here we can use closure. Let's understand it. Let's call a function and call it create log. Here we're going to supply a value, and this function will return another function, and this function will log the value. Okay, so now let's call this function in place of this function. We supply create log and call this value with I. Let's run and see. Now you see that we have the correct output. So what magic happened here? How it provided the correct output? So that is what closure is, that we just understood. When we call create log, when we are calling this function, okay, so we pass a value to it, and when this function is created, it is defining another function inside this. So for inner function, a closure is created, and this closure will refer to the value which its outer function has, and it will store the value of the variable when it is created. When the closure is created, it stores the value when it is created. So when I supply 0 for the first time, the closure for this function will be created, and the value in that closure will be the value with which it is called. So it will be 0. Again the loop moves forward. It calls that create log with value 1. So this new function will be created, and in the closure it will store the value 1, and similarly finally it will have the value 2. So when it is called, it will log the value from its own closure. So here we have got 3 functions, and these 3 functions hold different values when they are created. Okay, in their closure, and thus we are able to get the value when they are created. Now I hope you must have understood the closure, and closure actually can be drawn as a parallel to classes in object-oriented programming. So in object-oriented programming, we have classes which has got properties or variables, and methods or functions which operate on those variables. Functions with closure gives some sort of this possibility in JavaScript that we can have variables, and the function, inner function, can manipulate the variables defined inside the function, and this is actually what closure draws parallel with object-oriented programming. So I will meet you in the next interesting video. So do subscribe to our channel, comment and like if you have found it useful, and also hit the bell button so that you will get new updates delivered first to you.